Good morning, everyone, and here we are for our second of 3 videos before we have our midterm and the first of 2 essays are due. Indulge me, I'm just getting over a really bad stomach flu, so if I'm not my usual chipper self, I apologize, but we will plow through this. And the first thing I want to do is start with kind of a brief overview of the topics for the first essay. So for summer 2023, these are the ones that I'd like you to consider, and we'll briefly go through them. A couple of things we've already talked about. And then at the end of this section, I want to then go to the our FOL section. I want to show you where some of the content is being kept and also where to submit your essay. Okay. I'm also sounding really raspy, I apologize, but hopefully we'll get through this. Okay, so for essay topics, number 1, this is worth 15 marks. There are roughly 6 different questions. The first one is about the Greek alphabet. We talked about its importance. And you can see week 1, week 2. This would be actually module, right? Module 1 and 2. This is the framework that we use when we teach the course in class for the full term. But this is the compressed class. So where you see week on the page, that means module. So module 1, we looked at the Greek alphabet. We also talked about pre-Socratic thinkers who were looking for natural explanations for natural phenomena rather than mythological ones. And the reason why they could do this is because they were at least thinking scientifically for the first time. Week 2, we talk about philosophical thought, in particular as it was expressed by the pre-Socratics, rejecting mythology. There is a rejection of these old stories that now no longer really can address and deal with these new ideas that are being discussed about nature, about the cosmos, about rules and predictable patterns that exist behind nature. So this is what happens where pre-Socratic thinkers reject mythology, philosophical thought in particular and in general, no matter where you find it. They reject this idea of mythology as an explanation. So it looks to rational thinking, rational definitions and concepts, and that's where really the beginnings of philosophy start. Philosophy isn't just searching for reality, it's searching for concepts to define and explain reality. So given these improvements, why did this type of thinking encounter so much resistance with the Athenian citizens? We talk about the return to kind of a ritualistic, terrifying, anxiety-ridden kind of world where philosophers are telling people to reject the very things that had kind of given their lives meaning. Right? What was going on? So interesting idea to kind of look into. And as I will mention and will point out, a lot of the material that I used to create the slides, I've now given you as PowerPoint documents for you to go through. Question number 4, also week 2. The ancient Greeks cultivated a very tragic view of the world for what I've just described. The fact that it's nothing but choice. It's a world where chaos is just behind the sort of the informed and hoped for stability in the world. And so chaos, the void, nothingness, these are all kinds of things that would cause negative thoughts and anxiety of one sort or another, as they still do today. So the question is, how did Athenians cope with this kind of negative thinking? Because they cannot rely on mythology anymore. They now have to rely on concepts and rational thinking, and that terrifies a lot of citizens. So how were these negative thoughts expressed through philosophy or tragic theater? So if you are a fan of theater or a fan of storytelling, this is one that you might like. Question 5. Now we're moving into module 3. Some of the theological themes that are discovered and discussed in ancient Athenian philosophy, whether it's Plato or Aristotle or even prior to them, the pre-Socratics. And does the fact of the Greek religion being polytheistic, right, rather than monotheistic, does that affect the validity of their arguments? How does that change it? So this is a question regarding theology, polytheism versus monotheism, and still a very important one because it is the beginnings of a shift from one kind of thinking about religion to a very different one, and one that is, by comparison, certainly still around because we have monotheistic thinking in the 3 main religions that people practice today. So also in week 3, We talk about Xenophanes and David Hume saying that we cannot know God directly, but only know of him. St. Alpham and Thomas Aquinas writing much, much later in the 300s or the 1100s, depending where you're looking, whether it could be Aquinas, it could be St. Alpham. Earlier, it could have been St. Augustine, if you want to look even further. They argue, on the other hand, Alpham and Aquinas argue that God not only exists in reality, but the existence of his being is in fact self-evident by the fact that there is reality. So that's their argument. Which one of these two arguments grasps the concept of God in a more convincing way? Are these positions mutually incompatible? Or do they in fact argue that for the existence of a monotheistic God that may or may not be knowable? And finally, this is a question relating to Module 4, Philosophical Skepticism, which is a tool that is introduced early on in Greek thinking, but really not returned to until Descartes. And Descartes and Cartesian thinking really is grounded in philosophical skepticism. So is skepticism the best or the most effective way to search for the truth? How difficult would it be to discover and understand the world when all that is ever deduced with certainty is one's ability to think? And what is now facing thinkers today, at what point do you stop? If philosophical skepticism is a rigorous critical tool used in philosophical thinking, when do you know enough is enough? So that is pretty serious. Okay, so those are the questions that I want you to consider for the first 4 weeks. This last one here, also dealing with Descartes, but comparatively speaking, another thinker, Descartes talked about rationalism. Francis Bacon talked about empiricism, or an empirical thinking. So his idea, Bacon's, is based on experience, experimentation, on the senses, and he really is considered the father of modern science. So the question becomes, what are the strengths and weaknesses of empiricism and rationalism, especially in terms of being the best or most effective, quote-unquote, scientific method to grasp external reality? So the question that you wish to pose to yourself is, do each have their own strengths as well as their own weaknesses? And also you can decide maybe one is better than the other. So I'm not saying you have to, but do present both and present both, honestly and objectively. But certainly if you wish to decide that one is better than the other as a scientific method by saying Bacon is a better idea of grasping reality, better than Descartes, then that's your argument. Okay, so all of these 8 topics come from the first 4 weeks, and we're going to look at those very briefly. The first 4 modules that we've now crammed into 2 weeks. Okay, something I want to point out, students reserve the right to either devise their own original essay topics or 2, to modify the essay topics described above. All I ask you to do is, if you come up with an original idea, contact me as soon as possible, because you essentially have got a little over a week to write these. It's Friday morning right now. It's the 7th. So what I'm asking you to do is, when you think about these things, if you want to come up with your own topic, let me know as soon as possible. Now, if you don't need to contact me. But if you modify those questions enough that you're not quite sure whether it can be done in 800 to 1,000 words, it's good to contact me and let me know. Excuse me. So the essay will be submitted in doc or PDF format, and we'll be doing the Dropbox by Sunday, July 16th, 2023, or at the end of modules 5 and 6. In other words, the end of next week. So you have about 9 days to work on it. I apologize. It is a compressed course, but I wanted to talk about this as soon as possible. So the length of the paper, 3 or 4 pages, double-spaced 800 to 1,000 words. You can use either APA or MLA format. Be consistent. Normal size font, 11 or 12. Don't make it any smaller because I won't be able to read it. And don't make it huge either. But 11 or 12 is certainly very standard. Normal size margins, all those things are already built into your document or your software. So don't worry about that. Now, this is important. Please include in-text citations in the body paragraphs, even if you paraphrase or summarize your secondary sources. What I'm talking about here is this right here. So you need to include in-text citations in the body paragraphs. So I need to see where your secondary sources are being used in the paper and what they are. So your paper will be marked on how well you present the relevant course material. If you have chosen a position, let's say question 8, or the other question talking about, which thinker is the best view of understanding God or theology, because there you will take some sort of position. How do you persuade me of it? And because the way in which you argue for your conclusion is the way in which you argue in a persuasive kind of rhetorical mode. Present your evidence, present your argument. Okay, so late papers, anything after, they used to say week 6, but after week 3 will not be accepted. This is the compressed course online. There's some wiggle room. If there are some issues, please contact me ASAP, because I cannot help you if you contact me, say week 5, hey, I wasn't able to hand in the first paper. If you think there's going to be some issues, you need to contact me immediately. Okay, the other note too, please avail yourself of the weekly PowerPoint presentations. If you use my PowerPoints, cite them in the following manner. So right here you can see, I keep using my mouse here, I shouldn't be doing this. So it'll look something like this, right there. So in-text citation, let's say you use a statement from one of my slides, and in brackets or parentheses, Matthews, comma, module 4 rather than week 4. I apologize, I keep referring to weeks, but Matthews, module 4, slide 12. And it's placed at the end of the sentence, followed by a period. So now the other note here, if you use my slides, you do not need to include them as part of the bibliographical entry, because my slides have not been published and my slides change constantly. So let's say someone reading your paper 2 years from now may not find the information on the same slide number, or they may not find it at all. But you do need to identify to me in the body paragraphs. But that's all I need to see. Now, if you use other text, secondary sources, other PDFs that have been published, those you definitely need to put in your bibliography at the end. So it's a research paper. 50% of the mark will be a reflection of your sources and how you use them. And I need to see at least three secondary sources used in your paper, as well as cited in your bibliography. Now, if you use 3 sources and my slides, then I expect to see the 3 sources in the bibliography, but not my slides. Again, because they have not been published. Okay, I think that is pretty well it. Again, please refer to the online documents listed in the suggested weekly reading list that appear at the end of each of the PowerPoint presentations. And many of those sources I have already found for you, and I've put them into the recommended readings for each of the modules. And that's what I want to show you now as we switch over here. And if you go to content, well, first I'll show you this. Under evaluations, go to submissions. And there is essay number 1, due July 16th, 2023, 11:30. I'll move that to 11:59. Some people work till 11 o'clock, but I will change that to 11:59. But the first essay will be due on July 16th. So not this coming Sunday, but the next Sunday. Now, the thing I want to show you here that is really going to be helpful to students. Okay, so let's say Module 1, Language, Thought, and Philosophy in Ancient Athens. So we talked about this. Here are some key thinkers. Now, again, I write here the PDF files listed below are recommended rather than required reading. They have been posted for students who wish to consult them for essay writing purposes. This note also applies to all the other modules as well. Okay, so what does that mean? As you scroll down, there is the PowerPoint presentation. There is the PDF document. This is by Finley, called The Ancient Greeks. Another one by Finley, Who Were the Greeks? Havelock, who wrote a really, really interesting book on literacy and oral culture, the reinvention of the alphabet. There's some information there. The Hussey book on Introduction to Pre-Socratics and Pre-Socratic Thinking. Philip Wheelwright's book on Introduction to Pre-Socratics. Lots of material. And that is only the first one. To go to number 2, Monotheism, scroll through, and we have the PowerPoint presentation here we're going to talk about shortly. David Hume, History of Religion. David Hume, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. St. Alsam, Thomas Aquinas. And all the material that you need is right there. So please avail yourself of this material because it's there for you to write a really good essay. And also too, if you don't already know, there's a little find feature, like a little magnifying glass. So when you come up, once you open up your PDF, use that feature. It's a great little way to find information very quickly. If there's a particular phrase or word, let's say necessity. For St. Anselm and Aquinas, those words, or that word is very important. To show that something exists by necessity, if you want to find the argument in St. Anselm's writings where he speaks about that, then type in the word necessity in the little viewfinder, hit search, bingo, there it is. Oh, it's on page 37. And away you go. Saves you lots of time. You're looking for information. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. Each module will has its own little kind of library of material. They're all PDF documents, recommended but not required reading. And now when it comes time for the essay, they're going to be of great value to you. Okay, so let's now take a look at the material. Excuse me again. I don't know why my voice has been so raspy, but I'm not feeling 100%, but I'm going to do my best to get through this. Okay, so week 3 or module 3, we talked about monotheism and early Western thought. And the issues here are the first sort of thoughts in thinking about theology. Coming up with conceptions about God, ritualistic practices, mythology, the divine, and divination. In other words, expressions of the divine in the real world. So each individual tried to inquire into the ways in which you could understand theology without relying on mythology. So theology, which is more religion-based, is different than mythology. Yes, the overlap are the gods and goddesses that exist in both, but mythology are about stories. Theology is about the gods, right? It's about the divine. And sure enough, back in the 500 BC, we already had thinkers like Xenophanes saying, look, if you look at this objectively, he argued that it is impossible to know divinity with any degree of certainty. So straight out of the gate, we already have somebody telling us, no, I don't think we can really understand completely what we're talking about. We can know, we can know of theology and of God, but that's as far as it goes. So Xenophanes thought it was impossible to know divinity with certainty, and we can only know of it, of its existence. To describe it is futile. So we find here Xenophanes being one of the very first Greek thinkers to apply reason to the main problem of theology. Now, the solution in the past has been to take a leap of faith and say, look, I know science and philosophy cannot define, divinity, but I'm simply going to accept it. I'm going to make that leap of faith to the other side and believe. And Xenophanes says, that's fine. But if you were to apply reason to this dilemma, right, this unknowingness, you have to admit, it's impossible to know divinity. It really is. So he says, look, God is this utterly unique being. Now notice that he talks about God here, he's talking about Zeus, but you have to remember that Judaism already was in existence at the time Xenophanes is writing. So it's not as if the pre-Socratic thinkers were unaware that there was monotheistic thinking. There was at the time, but there was only one main religion, or in fact, one religion that had a singular God, Judaism. So Xenophanes is talking both about monotheistic, single God religions and gods in general. But he said these individuals are utterly unique beings and unlike other human beings in every aspect. We don't have the language to describe who they are. So Democritus, he sort of looks at the same question, the same issue, more from an anthropological view, and he relies on phenomena. So he is an anthropologist, he's more of a naturalist. He says, well, look, if we look at phenomena, celestial phenomena, thunder, lightning, eclipses, think of the weird weather we've seen in the last few years and how sometimes quite terrifying it can be. Democritus says, our ideas about religion may have come from that, right? This fear that we have of unnatural, events in the world. So celestial phenomena likely terrified the ancients to the degree that they were convinced that only the gods could have created this. There was something so powerful that we were witnessing in the world that only a deity, only a divinity could have created this thing in its awe-inspiring, beauty, or terrifying beauty, whatever it may be. So we have Xenophanes saying divinity and gods, we can only know of them. Democritus says, okay, I can believe people would buy into the idea of theology and gods by looking around and seeing that things inspire us, and we're filled with a sense of awe. Where does that come from? So that sense of awe could be divine. Oh, okay, that's where it comes from. Now, for every good idea, there's going to be an idea that is a lot more, perhaps more malicious or undermining, because again, philosophical skepticism is already being used here. So Critias pushed the debate even further when he declared, but without any kind of evidence, just an idea, that, quote, a wise and clever man invented fear of the gods for mortals, for there might be some means of frightening the wicked, even if they do anything or say anything in secret. So Critias is arguing that morality might have been a human invention to keep the wicked in check, because if you have no reason to stop yourself from being a wicked individual, you're going to go ahead and be an evil person. So Critias is saying, okay, on the one hand, this could have been an invention to kind of be used as a sort of crowd control, right? Or at least individual control. So I'm not saying that it's a horrible idea, but it is trying to create something that did have some serious impact on individuals, which is, the fear of retribution. So if there is some moral component to us, and again, Critias is doing this without any conclusive evidence, but is saying that perhaps it was invented by humans to keep us in check, to keep us from being wicked. And that's essentially what he's saying. Okay, so now we move from roughly 500 BC, boom, now we're going to move almost 1,000 years. And we move up to St. Alsum, and he wrote a series of theological dialogues and treatises trying to use reason and rationality to understand religion. And at this point, we are thinking in a monotheistic world, because by this point, paganism has been crushed by the Roman Empire, because Western Europe is basically the Holy Roman Empire, and monotheism is the order of the day. So paganism really ends up going underground. So in this realm, or in this world of monotheistic thinking, St. Alsum tries to come up with an ontological argument, right, for the existence of God, or at least some satisfactory theory that we can present to ourselves, where we have the critical tools of philosophy to understand something that perhaps philosophy cannot argue conclusively, right? Think of Xenophanes, but now St. Alsum is going to give it a shot. And he says, okay, he says, and he argues that faith not only precedes reason, faith comes before reason, but that reason can actually expand faith. So he writes famously, and I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but believe that I might understand. For this too I believe, since unless I first believe, I shall not understand. So it's not as if he's twisting himself into philosophical pretzels here. It's not highly illogical, but it is a way that for St. Alsum to balance these two forces, the forces of theology and the forces of philosophy. And he says, okay, I can ontologically argue. In other words, ontology, which is concepts and theories relating to being. So ontology, if it's about being, it's about the being of God, the existence of God. And he argues that reason can actually expand and widen and broaden our notion of faith. It isn't just, I believe. It's, I believe because. I believe because I see the work of God in the world around me. I see the work of God in the behavior of people. We see it confirmed with our own eyes and our senses that this ontological being exists, right? This theological being, God, actually exists. And this is how St. Anselm can reconcile these two otherwise opposing forces. And he does it in a way that allows reason to fit rather nicely in with religion. Okay, so Thomas Aquinas, also moving in a similar direction. His natural theology, also called Thomism, he wrote during the medieval period, so actually in this case the 1200s, and he comes up with various proofs for the existence of God, and he builds it upon Aristotle's assertions, this idea of the principles of being. Again, it's ontological, but what he comes up with is, he would say, Dio è la prima causa, right? Being Italian. So God is the first cause, the primary cause. He is the unmoved mover. Now, this idea comes into being and really gains some credence at this time, because the work of Aristotle has been rediscovered through unfortunately, the Crusades, which were horrible. But in the Crusades, something that was positive that came out of it was a rediscovery of the Arabic translations of Aristotle's work. So from that, it was translated back into Latin or into Greek, but it was actually the Arabic translations of Aristotle's work that brought Aristotle back into the fold as a fundamental thinker about theology. And Aquinas reads through his work, and he finds this incredible idea, right? This idea of the unmoved mover. And so he says, God is the ultimate cause of all things. Whether you want to call him a Big Bang theory, or the beginnings of everything, or when you think about the Holy Bible, in the beginning there was nothing, and then there was light. Well, this entity called God started it. So Aquinas marries up Aristotle's idea of the unmoved mover to the notion of God as this first cause, the primary cause of everything. So Aquinas argued that the existence of God was self-evident because we have a reality, and as soon as the word God is understood to exist mentally, he says that it exists actually. If we can imagine this being, then that being must exist fundamentally and necessarily, because we can conjure up this image in our mind of what God is. Now, at this point, Aquinas is not exactly worried about what Xenophanes had told us, which is, well, we'll never know who this person is. We may only know of them. And Aquinas says, well, okay, if we only know of them, what we know of God is his benediction, his benevolence, his ability to create worlds. And that's how he does it. And he says, okay, he creates these worlds. He is the first cause. He starts everything. So that's the argument that he presents. Now, the last person we look at here, David Hume, he introduces, again, a kind of a naturalistic account. Sounds a little bit like Democritus, right? Looking at nature to account for causes and effects, and then the development of religious thought. And Hume locates the origins of religion in emotion, right? Fear and desire to control the future. Now, notice fear is one of them. So that, again, it goes back to Democritus, saying, well, it's the fear of the power, the absolute power of nature, that if we can appease that power and we can supplicate it, if we can offer, rituals and prayers to it, maybe we can control it. So the desire to control the future really is the desire to control nature, right? The power and fury of nature at certain times. So Hume believes that polytheism actually resulted from these natural events, but because there were so many of them related to land, to water, to air, to, thunder and lightning, and all kinds of different things going on, Hume believes and argues that polytheism, which is the idea of many gods and goddesses, resulted from many events. Kind of makes sense. He says we cannot imagine them immediately ordered by one single intelligent being. So the variety of experiences, fearful or not, that the early civilizations, experienced may have accounted for the fact that polytheism was something really important to them. And so, by comparison, monotheism arises from the competition between these different polytheistic religions. And Hume argues that believers try to distinguish their deities as superior to all rivals, and that part is not difficult to buy into, because we see competition between religions still today. Those are religious wars. The religious wars that have occurred over the last few thousand years are exactly that, as one religious group tries to assert dominance over another one. And Hume says, as this occurs, some of these secondary gods and goddesses sort of fall away. And eventually people are arguing, saying, my God is better than your God, despite the fact that, okay, at the end of the day, is it not the same entity and just expressed differently? So Hume says that monotheistic drive to dominate other beliefs is probably at the core of monotheistic thinking. And yes, that doesn't make for necessarily better religion, but it yields intolerance, intellectual dishonesty, unnatural moral doctrines that attempt to show that one set of believers are somehow better than others. And like I say, we continue seeing this today. So Hume not only argues persuasively as to why religion is not capable of knowing anything about God, but also in creating believable dialogues that seriously struggle, right, with the more fundamental theological questions about its existence. We're more bogged down with using, emotion to argue that our God is better than your God. And that completely deflects away from those deeper theological questions about the existence of this entity in the first place and how morality works in the world. So Hume, very practical minded, again, accepts what some of the pre-Socratic thinkers have said and tries to work them into a more reasonable fashion, because Hume is writing in the 1700s. So we're talking, 1,500 years has passed. And during the time that he existed, there were many religious wars. So what he says really has a grain of reality. Before we go to the next set of or the next module, I'm going to just take a moment and have a drink of water. I'm going to see you back in 2 seconds. All right, welcome back. And through the magic of the pause button, I was able to go and get myself a drink of water, and hopefully it would sound a little less raspy. Again, I apologize. Not feeling the best. Okay. Module 4, or what would have been week 4 in a full course, we talk about the Enlightenment and the return of reason. Not that reason had never been around, but reason was used very differently during the medieval period to basically legitimize the power that the church had over everyday affairs. So by marrying up philosophy and theology together, reason was a very useful tool. And we saw in the previous module how reason was used to basically to validate the existence of God. Now, what happens here in this section, and we're talking now around the 1600s, we have the return of reason as a scientific tool. So I want to look at a couple of different thinkers. Descartes and Bacon in particular are usually discussed at the same time, but we also want to look at Galileo, and then we'll end with Machiavelli. So let's start with Descartes first. Now, Descartes is considered to be the father of modern Western philosophy. And really what he came up with was a return to an ancient critical tool, skepticism. And this is the tool that Plato and Aristotle had discussed. Pre-Socratics, not so much, but certainly it's an ancient philosophical tool that gets reinvented in a tremendous way by Descartes, especially in his book, Discourse on Method. And what Descartes wanted to do was establish a set of principles that could be truly known without doubt. No maybes, no possibly, should, could, might. No, known with absolute certainty. So let's strip away everything that can be doubted and start from an absolute solid foundation. And the word absolute really means what it means, right? There's nothing else. We start here. So the reason why Descartes is looked at as the father of modern Western philosophy is the way in which he uses skepticism to reject all ideas about reality that can be doubted. And then, starting from this foundation, reintegrate them into this sort of genuine knowledge, genuine absolute knowledge. I do not doubt anything. Now, using his method, Descartes realized that he could only come up with a single fundamental principle. What was that? That thought exists. Thought cannot be separated from him or his being, therefore he must exist. Now, what's ironic is Descartes then went ahead and split mind and body and said that mind can operate independently of the body, but in his argument he's saying, okay, my thought cannot be separated from my being, therefore I must exist. Okay, point taken. And so he says, if that is correct, I can strip away everything else. But the one thing I cannot, even if I'm doubting, I'm still thinking. So the act of thinking, the act of thought, that's what exists. And so that's his fundamental discovery. But it is a powerful one. And so he begins to construct this worldview using rationalism and creates what becomes in philosophy Continental Rationalism. Continental because it's Western European and it's based on the use of rationality and reason. So it's a branch of Western physics that uses and sees human reason as the foundation of the natural sciences. So reason becomes a chief source and measure of all knowledge. Truth is discovered not through the senses, in other words, not from an empirical point of view, but from a rational point of view. And he says truth can only be discovered can only be discovered using reason because our senses can fool us. If you look outside, or let's say on a hot day on an asphalt driveway or something, or far away on a highway, it looks like there's water there when it isn't. Right? There isn't water there at all. So our senses can trick us. And Descartes says because of that, we can only use intellectual deduction, strip away everything that can be doubted, even if it means we strip it all the way back to simply that thought exists. That's where we start. So that's a fundamental break. And so with this, Descartes goes on to prove the existence of God, saying that, God wouldn't trick me, wouldn't fool me into thinking that he doesn't exist. And if I can think of that, and because reason is a divine gift, then of course God exists. So Descartes did do different things with his methodological skepticism, but what he does, one of the stranger things is splitting mind from body and saying that mind can exist independently. Now, it doesn't mean that the brain sits in a box somewhere and lives on. What he means is the mind can conjure up its own ideas. In other words, a mind without using the senses can come up with its own ideas. That's essentially what he's saying. Now, by comparison, Francis Bacon is also just as influential, but his scientific method is a much different one. Now, he also uses skepticism and uses a very methodical approach, but in the same way that Descartes is considered the father of modern rationality, Bacon is equally considered the father of empiricism, empirical thinking through the senses, resulting from the senses. So that's what Bacon does. He says, okay, my method argues for the possibility of scientific knowledge based not on intellectual deduction, which is the deduction that Descartes is famously trying to champion. But he says, no, induction, careful observation of the events. So Bacon's scientific method is achieved through both a skeptical method and also an approach where we are collecting information, testing it, retesting it, coming up with a hypothesis, not some absolute etched in stone idea, but a hypothesis. And then we retest. And if the hypothesis doesn't prove correct, we test again. So it uses skepticism, it uses experimentation, and what changes, or what is different between Descartes and Bacon, is the fact that Bacon combines both rationalism and empiricism. With Descartes, rationalism is everything. So we can conjure up the idea of a unicorn, for example, because we know what a horn looks like, or at least a pointy looking thing, and we know what a horse looks like. So we can imagine something like that. And Bacon says, sure, but we have no proof they exist. So really, Can I prove absolutely that I can imagine a unicorn as opposed to no, they don't exist? Because we can think of all kinds of weird things in our heads, but we know they don't exist. Bacon says, okay, well, that's really not a useful way to understand the world. But if we use induction, right? If we look at all the things that we have, we not deduce, but induce. In other words, I'm going to look at every swan in the world, and every single one that I've seen is white. Therefore, I will hypothetically state with some degree of certainty, not absolute, that swans are white. Okay, but if I see a black one, I've got to rethink it. So Bacon tries to be much more open to correction, modification, experimentation, testing and retesting, and that's why Bacon is considered the father of the modern scientific method, the testing and retesting that we know science actually is. Now, the last two people I want to look at here, because we've been going for about 40 minutes here, but I want to make sure we finish up everything. Very briefly, we looked at Galileo, who was an Italian astronomer, and he also played a very major role in scientific revolutions taking place in Western Europe. And Galileo's main idea is his belief in heliocentrism. Now, heliocentrism is this idea in which the Earth as a planet and the planets themselves revolve around the sun, and the sun is at the center of our solar system. Now, that idea was very controversial at its time because scientists were, well, kind of having to conform to this idea of geocentrism, in which the Earth is stationary and everything revolves around it. And this was the church's position, and that's what I mean when I say scientists didn't really have a choice. If you wanted to be considered a heretic or a blasphemer or burnt at the stake, you really had to toe the line. And so it was sometimes literally dangerous. You were taking your life in your hands if you were to try to contradict or undermine the church's position on various ideas. But Galileo tried, and he eventually succeeded by presenting heliocentrism. And he said through observation, as I am an astronomer, this is what I see. And I believe that the Earth moves around the sun, not the other way around. So that's his claim to fame. And then the last one, also now, not necessarily a philosopher that we've looked at, but certainly a political philosopher, which at this point was a new field just literally in its infancy. Because we don't have democratic systems at this point, but we have the beginnings of political thinking. And Machiavelli is the founder of modern political science. And probably his most famous book, The Prince, we find the main character, the titular character, as they say, acting in a very Machiavellian fashion. Now, what does that mean? Well, based on Machiavelli's description of the prince, to act in a Machiavellian manner is to act very unscrupulously, dishonestly, deceitful, deviously, killing innocent civilians if you have to, in order to grasp and maintain power. So Machiavelli in his book appears to endorse this kind of behavior. Now, what Machiavelli has never come out and said truthfully, and this was intentionally, or sort of entirely his intention, was to let people figure out for themselves. He presents these horrible, behavioral traits of the main character, the prince. Now, we call that Machiavellian, but there's no reason to say that maybe it's a cautionary tale. Maybe, we need to think, do the ends justify the means? Is this really the way we want politicians to behave? Here is the worst case scenario of a politician called a prince. So Machiavelli is presenting it as if he endorses it, but we never, ever knew. He never said one way or the other whether he said, or argued, yeah, the prince is me. This is what I think politicians should do. But it is a form of behavior, a type of behavior that is very much considered unscrupulous by politicians. So his intellectual contribution to the history of political thought is that distinction between political realism, right? The reality of grasping power and maintaining power versus idealism. the idea that you wish to make the world better for everybody else, to be a good politician, to make sure you don't leave anyone out. Well, Machiavelli says that's all fine and good, but the reality of it is going to be almost impossible, because the moment you show weakness, someone else that's just a little bit more powerful than you is going to come after you. So what Machiavelli is asking us to consider is whether these political ends justify the idealistic means. So if the idealistic means is, I want control over everything, well, it's going to be a bloody road all the way there. So force may be used to stabilize political power, to introduce new legal institutions, but that same force that brings something into being can also be used to eliminate political rivals. And if that's the case, if you are someone that wishes to be feared, you can use that same force to coerce, right, that restless population. And you know that historically, even today, we have powerful leaders who really behave in this way, completely Machiavellian. They wish to, they want to be feared more than they are adored, because people are afraid. They're afraid of losing their lives. So to have a leader who is feared more so than liked, that's a Machiavellian trait. So we've already pointed out this kind of devious political advice is still recognized today as being Machiavellian. We still see those things today. So any politician who uses deceit and dishonesty and is willing to basically trample on human rights to not only achieve power, but to maintain it. Machiavelli presents a very sordid and really terrible picture of what politics could be like. Whether or not he endorses it, he took that to his grave. It's up to us to decide what he meant. Okay, so those are the two modules for this week. I'm sorry I went over a little bit, but I wanted to make sure all of you were clear on what's needed for the upcoming essay, the first one. And then what I'll do in week 5 is the same thing. We'll do the two modules, and then we're going to take a little bit of time, probably a little quicker, because the format will be identical, just different questions. But I just want to make sure that these were done. So take care, everyone, and we'll see each other next week. Hopefully I will be sounding and feeling a lot better, but I wanted to get this done because I'm willing to take one for the team. I want to make sure all of you are going to be in the know as to what's happening. So any questions, please contact me as soon as possible, because you only have 9 days to write an 800-word paper. So please get to it as quickly as you can, and I'll answer your questions as soon as I see them. In the meantime, have a great weekend, and we'll see each other next Friday. Take care then. Bye-bye.